I represent Asia Pacific in the working group. There are 5 members, and I think I would like to briefly mention about the working group because what I'm doing today is part of our mandate, because we would like to disseminate and implement the UN guiding principles globally, and an event like this is very critical to achieve this particular objective. We also do capacity building seminars and workshops, and I think this is a very important role, because if you are not aware of the implications, you cannot really implement the guiding principles. Of course, we focus on other aspects. For instance, we do 2 country visits every year as a working group, and only early this month we visited Thailand, not very far from here. So we did a country visit to Thailand, and in the month of July the working group will visit Kenya in Africa. So we do visit 2 countries every year, and then we make an assessment how that country is implementing the UN guiding principles, and we provide a report with some recommendations. So that is just to provide some context. I also want to briefly highlight that this meeting should be a first step for our continuous engagement. I would like to encourage all of you in this room to engage with the working group. And there are a number of opportunities, as I mentioned on this slide, how you can engage with us. Of course, we have a big annual forum in Geneva, and that will take place in the month of November 26th to 28th. So you can, in fact, the call for papers is available now. So you should submit some interesting proposals from Indonesia. You can also participate without a panel. Then we have 3 sessions of the working group in Geneva, and you can participate even by telephone. We have 1-hour consultation with business and 1-hour consultation with civil society during each of our sessions. So if you would like to consult with us and participate, you can participate even from Jakarta. You don't need to come in person. We also have country visits, I already mentioned to you, but we also receive complaints. So if a civil society, any university professor, any lawyer, they think that a particular business activity has impacted adversely human rights, you can also send complaints to the working group. And if we find this complaint to be reasonable, then we write to the relevant government as well as relevant companies and seek their response about that particular allegation. We do not investigate, but we try to help the relevant state and the businesses to address that particular issue that has been raised to our attention. So that is something you may take into account. Now let us focus on the National Action Plan. From the working group's perspective, the NAP process is one of the most crucial tools to implement the UN guiding principles. At the same time, we also acknowledge that countries are very, very different. They are different in terms of the political system, legal system. They are different in terms of the economic and social conditions. And just to provide a concrete example, Indonesia has more than 17,000 islands. This is very unique. Not all countries are like Indonesia. And there are people living in more than 6,000 islands. So how do you come up with a plan to implement business and human rights in a country like Indonesia? It's a unique issue. And you have to deal with this particular challenge, and that's why one size do not really fit all the countries, all the situations. Of course, we have provided some guidance which is generic to all the states, but each country has to deal with specific issues. So you have to find what are the specific issues for Indonesia, both for the state and the businesses. Make that assessment and then come up with a Nation Action Plan which responds to those issues. These issues could be internal to Indonesia, and these issues could be external as well. How Indonesian government is operating outside Indonesia, or Indonesian companies operating outside Indonesia. We have issued, the working group had issued a guidance document, and that guidance document talks about 4 key criteria of any national action plan. First of all, and this is self-explanatory, the NAP process should be based on the UN guiding principles. But this is not merely enough, and I already mentioned to you, it should deal with the specific challenges of that particular country. What we stress very much is the inclusive and transparent process of developing the plan. It should consult all the key stakeholders in a particular country. So the process is equally important as the product. You cannot sacrifice the process or the product. And finally, because no plan can be perfect, it should be regularly reviewed and updated. So these are the 4 key criteria that we prescribe for all the states. In terms of the process, there are 5 steps, or you can say 5 phases of developing this process. And these 5 stages have a sequence. And you can also try to see where Indonesia is in terms of these 5 processes. So the first stage, or the first phase, is that the government has to make a commitment that we are going to start drafting a national action plan. And I think Indonesian government has already made that commitment. So I think we can say that the phase 1 is already covered in this particular sense, because the government is already moving in this particular context to draft this process. The second phase, or the second step in this process, is to do a baseline assessment. That what are the key challenges in Indonesia? What sectors we should give more priority? And I think the process and the draft prepared by the Human Rights Commission of Indonesia could be seen in this particular phase 2, where the assessment was made and a proposal was made that how the NAP process should be drafted in the context of Indonesia. Again, consultation with all the stakeholders is very, very critical as part of this particular process. We believe that critical voices must always be heard. I will not name the country, but there are experiences of the working group in which the government did not listen to the critical voices, which are the affected stakeholders, community members, farmers, indigenous peoples, women, who may be adversely affected by business activities. And if you do not engage constructively with those stakeholders, then the process will lack legitimacy. They will not endorse it. And then this document will not really serve any useful purpose. The third step is the actual drafting of the NAP process. So after the baseline assessment is done, then someone, it could be a team of experts, it could be some officials in the relevant ministries which are coordinating the process of drafting. They should draft the document, and again you should consult all the stakeholders on the draft. And after that consultation, then you finalize and release this particular document. The fourth phase is about implementation. Because unless you implement what you promise you will do, it is just a piece of paper. It does not really mean anything. In fact, it is better not to have this piece of paper if you don't want to implement it. So it is very crucial that the implementation of whatever is promised is there. And to implement, you need some collaboration amongst different ministries and departments. Of course, you need resources, you need multi-stakeholder bodies which can monitor the process of implementation. And finally, because no NAP can be perfect, it is very crucial that you regularly review and update the document that you have. And again, you can revise and improve as a particular process. So these are the 5 sequential stages. So you cannot skip 2 and 3 and come to 4. So this is the logical sequence. So these are the 5 phases, and you start at 1 and we hope you go to 5 in this particular sequence. And this is a generic guidance that we have for all the states in the process of drafting. Now I would like to share some experiences that the working group has gained of this process of NAP in different parts of the world. At this particular point of time, we have 19 countries which have formally adopted NAPs. And here I am not including those countries or jurisdictions in which a NAP has been adopted, let us say, by the Human Rights Commission or civil society. I'm only listing here those countries in which the government has adopted a particular NAP. And you will see here is that Asia is missing. So at this particular point of time, there's not a single country from Asia that has adopted a national action plan. It's predominantly in Europe, as you will see, and there are some countries, 2 countries in South America, and of course the United States of America. So these are the 19 states that we have. But this dynamic is changing in Asia, and we hope that by 2020, within the next 2 years, several countries in Asia would have a national action plan. So we call it the 2020 target. And like we visited Thailand recently, as I mentioned to you, and it is very likely, touch wood, that Thailand may be the first country to have a national action plan possibly later this year. Malaysia has also started the process of drafting, and Indonesia, I hope, is on the target. And I just learned that the government issued this to include business and human rights as part of the human rights policy. And hopefully later on, that will be a good opening that is built further to develop a comprehensive national action plan on business and human rights. Now let me share some experiences now, broad experiences. One is that there is no one way to adopt a national action plan. There are different processes. The most common process, of course, is that the government is leading it. But in certain countries, it is also the case that it could be a national human rights institution leading the process. From our perspective, I think the ownership of the government is very, very critical. Because business and human rights, the state has to lead from the front. Business and human rights is not merely about business. It is also about the states performing their duties. And they are setting a framework and guiding businesses what they should be doing in relation to human rights. Of course, this particular event and what INFID is doing, what other CSOs are doing in Indonesia is a reflection of this, that some institutions are trying to push the government and other stakeholders to adopt a national action plan. And of course, the National Human Rights Commission here drafted a document and presented it to the government, which could be a good reference point for the government to adopt a national action plan. Now, in terms of should this plan be a standalone or should it be part of a generic plan on human rights? This is a judgment each country has to make. The 19 NAPs that I mentioned, these are stand-alone NAPs on business and human rights. But from the working group's perspective, it is also fine if a country would like to introduce business and human rights element into a plan on human rights generally, or into a policy framework which is trying to implement sustainable development goals. Because we do not want too many parallel things happening. That may be inefficient for the government. And that's why each government should consider what is the best way forward for it to draft this plan on business and human rights. In any case, even if it is a standalone document, it cannot be a watertight compartment which has no correlation with something else. You have to achieve a policy coherence. And I think that is very, very vital in this particular context. Now, the other lesson that I would like to share is and which I already hinted, is that merely talking about nice things is not going to work. The government has to walk the talk. Businesses have to walk the talk. We should not consider business and human rights as a public relation exercise. It's much more than a strong policy commitment and political commitment to ensure that these policy documents are implemented seriously in this particular context. The progress has to be continuous. You cannot change everything overnight. And it is fair for each government and businesses and states to signpost that, okay, at this particular point of time, we are doing ABC, then after 2 years, we will do more. So it's a process. And that's why if you have a roadmap of progress, that is very useful. It will also allow states to manage expectations. Because some stakeholders may expect too many outcomes from the NAP process. You need to manage expectations to avoid significant disappointment. And that's why if you can lay out this particular process, I think that would be very, very useful. I already mentioned before that the process and the outcome both should be transparent. Legitimacy will not be there. And all the stakeholders should be consulted. Even if the government is not able to accommodate certain recommendations, that is fine, but you must be transparent about it. You must be open about it. That these are the recommendations we have received. We do not have the consensus at this point of time to adopt these recommendations, but we will consider them as an ongoing basis. That is the way forward. You should not be ignoring those recommendations and putting them under the carpet, because that would make the process lacking legitimacy and non-transparent. For each country, there are too many issues. It's very, very obvious. Then each country should consider having the priorities. What are the key challenges that we have in Indonesia, for that matter, on business and human rights? And you try to deal with those issues of priority at that particular point of time. At the same time, we cannot ignore anything. Like, you should not think that the business and human rights is merely about big multinational companies. It is also about small companies. It is also about informal sector, the home business, which we often do not talk about. And that's why it is very crucial that you consider all the dimensions of these business players. It is also about state-owned enterprises. It's not merely private companies doing something, and the companies which are controlled and owned by the state are ignored when it comes to the NAP process. It's a very critical role to play. The last issue on this point I would like to highlight is that the NAP process should look at the impact both within Indonesia and outside. We call it inward and outward. So foreign companies operating in Indonesia, as well as Indonesian companies operating in Indonesia, have to be covered. But you have to also consider the impact of Indonesian companies operating outside Indonesia. What is the responsibility of the government to those companies which are operating outside Indonesia? Let us say you have an Indonesian company operating in Cambodia, and there are those violations taking place in Cambodia. What is the responsibility of the government, including of the Human Rights Commission, to deal with potential complaints? You may have read in the newspaper that recently a case has been filed against a Thai company for its behavior in Cambodia. So these victims in Cambodia are filing a case against a Thai company in Thailand. This is becoming a common trend in this particular field. There are many cases which are filed outside that particular state. So I think it's very crucial to consider that. The other issue I would like to highlight is that all of us in society are not the same. They are migrant workers, they are women, they are children, they are people of ethnic minorities, they are indigenous communities. They may experience the adverse impact differently. And that's why it is very fundamental that this process of NAP should consider the different impact on different groups of people who may be marginalized or who may be more exposed to exploitation. And those elements should be taken into account. Pillar 3 of the guiding principles is about access to remedy. And access to remedy is very, very critical, because if there are violations which are not addressed, then those should be remedied, and that's why the remedies become crucial. My last point is about collective action. Many of the business and human rights challenges cannot be dealt with by any one particular state. Whether we're talking about environmental pollution, climate change, or migrant workers, or supply chain. These are the issues that would require collaboration amongst different states. And because Indonesia is part of this ASEAN, then the collaboration within this region is going to become very, very critical element. So Indonesian government should, and this is our recommendation to all the countries, that you have to do something about this BHR issues within your country. But you also need to collaborate with other countries in the region. And in this particular context, the ongoing process to negotiate a binding instrument, that is the process going in Geneva, may become relevant. And the Indonesian government is engaging with this particular process, so you need to also consider that how do you collaborate with this particular process of a binding instrument on business and human rights, and how could this help all the states working together to deal with the BHR challenges. Alright, so let me conclude by highlighting what I call 6 C's. The first C is about coordination. And I think I already see this because Indonesian government has already established a coordination group. The Ministry of Economic Affairs is leading it in consultation with other ministries. So that is what the first step is very crucial. There should be a coordination, which is, I think, is already there. But you also need to have this coordination between the central government and the provinces. And that's why raising awareness and building capacity at the provincial level is going to be quite crucial. The second is coherence. Because there are issues about trade and investment. So the government cannot have human rights as a separate compartment, and when it comes to trade and investment policies, you ignore human rights altogether. This human rights should be the business of the government, whatever it do, whatever policies and steps it are taking at the national level or international level. The third C is consultations. I already highlighted how critical the process is, and the feedback that you receive, you should try to respond to that feedback. The fourth C is comprehensive. The NAP process, of course, can give priority to certain issues, but it should cover all 3 pillars of the UN guiding principles. It should not look at only one sector or one set of issues. The fifth C is commitment. Commitment to implement is very, very vital. And finally, there has to be this continuity where you're trying to adopt a policy at this particular point of time, and then you are reassessing it, how we can improve it and make it better. Thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any questions or any comments, I'll be happy to deal with those questions and comments. But let me once again thank all the